If you're thinking about buying a home, there's a quiet fear sitting in your head right now. What if prices finally cool after you buy? Or worse, what if waiting makes everything more expensive? You've probably heard that the housing market is slowing, inventory is rising, and price growth is easing. So waiting feels safer. Honestly, that belief makes sense. Here's what surprised me when I dug into the data for 2026. National prices may rise modestly, but that slowdown is not happening everywhere. In several large U.S. cities, prices are expected to rise much faster, not because demand is exploding, but because supply never caught up. You'll notice that many Midwest and Northeast cities added very little housing for years, so even moderate demand keeps pushing prices higher. You might be thinking higher rates should stop that, but in tight markets, scarcity wins. That realization completely changes how you see 2026, and it leads directly into the cities most people are overlooking. What surprised me? When researching these cities. What honestly surprised me while researching these cities was how disconnected the headlines are from what the data actually shows for 2026. You'd expect the biggest price jumps to come from flashy coastal or fast-growing southern markets. But instead, the strongest growth is concentrated in large Midwest and Northeast cities that barely get attention. These places added very little housing over the past several years, so inventory stayed tight while demand never fully disappeared. You'll notice prices there are still below national averages, yet competition remains steady. That quiet imbalance is what sets the stage for why 2026 will reward overlooked markets, not the obvious ones, leading directly into why price growth won't be spread evenly next year, why 2026 won't be the same everywhere. Here's where a lot of people get misled about the housing market going into 2026. Nationally, price growth is expected to slow to a modest pace, which sounds like relief, but that average hides a huge divide. You'll notice that markets in the South and West added far more new homes in recent years, and that extra supply is finally catching up to demand, flattening prices or even pushing them down in some areas. That's not what's happening in much of the Midwest and Northeast. In those regions, new construction lagged for years, leaving very little inventory available. You might be thinking that higher mortgage rates should cool things off everywhere, but in places where supply is already tight, even small pockets of demand are enough to keep prices climbing. That imbalance is why 2026 won't feel balanced at all, depending on where you look, which is exactly what starts to show up when you break this down city by city. Number 10. Milwaukee, Waukesha West, Dallas, Wisconsin. Number 10 is Milwaukee, Waukesha West, Dallas. And this is one of those metros that quietly slips under the radar while setting up for meaningful price growth. Home prices here are expected to rise about 7% in 2026, even though the median home price sits around $379,000, which still feels reasonable compared to many large U.S. markets. What surprised me when researching this metro is how little new housing has been added relative to steady local demand. You'll notice Milwaukee doesn't get talked about as a booming market. And honestly, that's exactly why it works. This area hasn't been flooded with new construction, so inventory remains tight enough that prices keep moving higher without needing a surge of buyers. Locals say competition feels steady rather than chaotic. But in a supply-constrained market, steady is more than enough. This is the kind of place where price growth happens quietly, not dramatically, and that pattern becomes even clearer when you move one spot higher on the list to number 9. Number 9. Columbia, South Carolina. Number 9 is Columbia, South Carolina, and this city stands out because it breaks the pattern most people associate with the South right now. Home prices here are expected to rise about 7.2% in 2026, with a median home price around $303,300, which remains relatively affordable for a large metro. Here's the weird part. While many southern markets are seeing price growth slow, or even turn negative due to years of heavy new construction, Colombia didn't build nearly as aggressively. That left inventory tighter than people realize, even as demand stayed consistent. You'll notice this city doesn't feel like a boomtown, but that quiet balance is exactly what allows prices to keep climbing. Locals say buyers aren't chasing trends here. They're looking for stability. And in a market with limited supply, that's enough to push values higher. This makes Colombia a perfect example of how 2026 rewards restraint, setting the stage for number 8 on the list. Number 8. Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Number 8 is Winston-Salem, North Carolina, a city that quietly behaves nothing like the fast-moving southern markets people usually talk about. Home prices here are expected to rise about 7.7% in 2026, with a median home price around $342,899, placing it in a sweet spot between affordability and upward pressure. What stood out while researching this metro is how limited new housing has been compared to steady local demand. You'll notice Winston-Salem didn't experience the same construction surge that cooled prices in other parts of the South. That restraint matters. In a market where supply stayed tight, prices don't need dramatic population growth to keep rising. Locals say competition feels manageable but constant, which is often the most dangerous setup for buyers waiting on the sidelines. This city shows how scarcity quietly beats hype, and it leads directly into why the next city on the list feels more obvious but still surprises people. Number 7. New Haven, Milford, Connecticut. Number 7 is New Haven, Milford, Connecticut, and this metro perfectly captures what's happening across much of the Northeast right now. Home prices here are expected to rise about 7.7% in 2026, with a median home price around $439,000, putting it above the national median but still attractive compared to nearby high-cost cities. What surprised me when looking at this area is how demand has stayed elevated even as buyers pull back elsewhere. You'll notice many buyers here are looking for more affordable, commutable alternatives to larger, more expensive metros nearby, and that steady demand runs straight into a wall of limited supply. This region is older and more built out, which means new housing has lagged for years. Locals say the market feels competitive but not chaotic. Yet in a place where inventory is scarce, that steady pressure keeps pushing prices higher. This is a clear example of how proximity and supply constraints quietly drive growth, which becomes even more obvious as you move to number 6 on the list. Number 6. Baltimore, Columbia, Towson, Maryland. Number 6 is Baltimore, Columbia, Towson, Maryland, a metro many people assume already peaked, which is exactly why its projection catches attention. Home prices here are expected to rise about 8.3% in 2026, with a median home price near $375,000, placing it below several neighboring high-cost markets. What stood out during research is how this area continues to attract buyers looking for relatively affordable options within commuting distance of major employment hubs. You'll notice demand hasn't disappeared here, even as other markets cool, but new housing hasn't kept pace. This region, like much of the Northeast Corridor, is built out, leaving limited room for rapid construction. Locals say buyers are realistic rather than speculative, yet that steady interest presses against a tight supply. That imbalance quietly fuels price growth and explains why this metro edges higher on the list, setting up an even stronger example of supply pressure at number 5. Number 5. Hartford West. Hartford, East Hartford, Connecticut. Number 5 is Hartford West, Hartford East, Hartford, Connecticut. And this metro shows how quickly prices can move when supply has nowhere to go. Home prices here are expected to rise about 9.5% in 2026, with a median home price around $429,000, placing it above the national median, yet still within reach compared to larger nearby metros. What surprised me while researching this area is how little new housing has been added, despite steady demand from buyers seeking more affordable options within commuting distance of major Northeast job centers. You'll notice this region is older and densely developed, which limits how fast new supply can come online. Locals say listings don't sit long, not because of bidding wars, but because choices are limited. That quiet scarcity amplifies even modest demand, pushing prices higher faster than most people expect, which leads directly into the next city where this same pressure becomes even more intense. Number 4. Rochester, New York. Number 4 is Rochester, New York, and this city is a perfect example of how pressure builds quietly in places most people overlook. Home prices here are expected to rise about 10.3% in 2026, with a median home price around $256,900, which remains well below national averages. What stood out during research is how strong that growth projection looks relative to how affordable the market still is. You'll notice Rochester sits in a region where new housing development has been limited for years, yet demand remains steady as buyers look for stability and value. This isn't a boom town, and locals say the market feels calm on the surface, but that's the deceptive part. In a supply-constrained environment, calm demand still pushes prices upward quickly. That pressure cooker effect explains why Rochester climbs this high on the list, and why the next city feels even more surprising when you see the numbers. Number 3. Scranton-Wilkes-Barre-Hazleton, Pennsylvania. Number 3 is Scranton-Wilkes-Barre-Hazleton, Pennsylvania, a metro that almost never comes up in national housing conversations, yet the numbers for 2026 are hard to ignore. Home prices here are expected to rise about 10.9%, with a median home price around $260,000, keeping it well below national averages while showing one of the strongest growth projections on the list. What surprised me while researching this area is how powerful the affordability factor still is, especially for buyers looking to escape higher-cost Northeast metros. You'll notice demand hasn't disappeared here, but new housing development has remained very limited for years. Locals say buyers aren't rushing in waves, they're arriving steadily, and that steady demand collides with a tight supply. That combination quietly accelerates prices without creating headlines, which is exactly why this market jumps so high and sets up the even bigger surprise waiting at number 2. Number 2. Syracuse, New York. Number 2 is Syracuse, New York, and this is where the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Home prices here are expected to rise about 12.4% in 2026, with a median home price around $298,950, which is still far below many large U.S. markets. What stood out immediately during research is how consistently demand has held up despite broader market cooling. You'll notice Syracuse sits within reach of larger, higher-cost Northeast metros, making it attractive to buyers searching for affordability without completely disconnecting from regional job markets. New housing development here has lagged for years, so inventory remains tight, even without a surge of buyers. Locals say homes don't linger, not because of bidding frenzies, but because there simply aren't many options. That quiet pressure is why Syracuse lands this high, and it leads straight into the city that shocked me more than any other on this list. Number 1. Toledo, Ohio. Number 1 is Toledo, Ohio, and this city completely flipped expectations when the data came together. Home prices here are expected to rise about 13.1% in 2026, the highest projected growth of any large U.S. city on the list, while the median home price sits around $199,900. That number is not only far below national averages, it's also well under Ohio's statewide median, which is what makes this so striking. What surprised me most is how extreme the imbalance is between affordability and supply. You'll notice Toledo hasn't seen much new housing development in recent years, yet demand has remained steady, not explosive, just constant. Locals say buyers are drawn by value, and in a market this affordable, it doesn't take many buyers to move prices quickly. This is the clearest example of how scarcity beats hype, and it brings everything together into the one rule that explains why these cities rise while others stall. The one pattern that explains every city. When you step back and look at these cities together, one pattern becomes clear. The fastest home price growth in 2026 isn't happening where demand is loud. It's happening where housing supply stayed tight for years. Across much of the Midwest and Northeast, new construction lagged while demand remained steady. Even without hype, you'll notice many of these markets still have prices below national averages, which keeps buyers active. That steady demand, colliding with limited inventory, quietly pushes prices higher, while heavily built markets cool at the same time. Here's the part most people don't realize until it's too late. These cities don't feel hot, they don't feel urgent, and they don't dominate headlines, which is exactly why prices are projected to rise there the fastest in 2026. In markets where supply stayed tight and demand never disappeared, waiting doesn't create opportunity. It quietly removes it. By the time these places feel obvious, affordability is already gone, competition is already higher, and the window people assumed they had is already closed.